It's one of the most rugged and remote estates in Scotland, but in just 12 years, residents of Knoydart have seen 2 absentee landlords come and go. The latest laird is Stephen Hinchliffe, a Yorkshire businessman whose chain of high street stores collapsed 2 years ago with massive debts. He's currently being investigated for fraud. So can the new man of Knoydart turn the estate's fortunes around? Roads to Knoydart, but each year thousands of tourists make the journey by boat or on foot. For anyone who loves the outdoors, it's easy to see why. There's a small but thriving community here who happily trade the convenience of urban living for their rather splendid isolation. The rough wilderness that is Knoydart doesn't make it easy for the 50 or so residents to eke out a living. But over the past 15 years, it's become increasingly difficult for anyone here to plan ahead. The peninsula has been passed from one owner to the next in a series of mysterious deals. Locals still haven't met the latest owner, but they're concerned to hear that he's yet another English-based businessman with no obvious ties to the Highlands and a very checkered past. The new laird of Knoydart comes from South Yorkshire. 48-year-old Stephen Hinchliffe bought the estate in February, although how much he paid for it remains a mystery. His involvement has surprised many since he's currently under investigation by the Serious Fraud Office for his last business failure. His plans for the estate have not yet been made public. Knoydart may look idyllic, but years of neglect under the previous 2 owners have left the estate in desperate need of investment. But with Mr. Hinchliffe's track record in business, the community is naturally suspicious of his intentions here.
Having heard the names and of the new owners and their backgrounds, I think it more or less horrified everybody in the community and elsewhere.
I think the whole thing's disgusting, really, just disgusts me. The deviousness of the whole setup. And I was always like to plan ahead. How can you plan ahead if you're not? It's like dealing with jelly.
They promise you the earth and they come up with absolutely nothing. Going to do this and going to do that, and he hasn't done nothing at all.
For the last 5 years, former Army Captain Ian Robertson has worked for the estate. Since 1995, as manager, he's overseen its day-to-day running. But even he hasn't met the new owner or been told in any detail what Mr. Hinchliffe's plans are.
They say that they're going to turn it into a professional Highland estate and invest some capital in it.
Have you seen any signs of that capital yet?
No, we haven't.
Until the middle of the last century, Knoydart was a place where generations lived and died. After the Highland clearances, the population of 500 was all but shipped out. Today, many former residents make their final journey home to be buried in the tranquility of the local graveyard. Although most of the current population of 50 are incomers, there's still a very strong sense of community here.
When the eastern star tells back in time is near my jaw.
In just 12 years, there have been 3 owners of Knoydart Peninsula, all absentee landlords. Residents retain a sense of humour about the elusive lairds, but their lack of commitment to Knoydart has left it in a state of serious neglect. First to arrive as a knight in a shining helicopter in 1986 was Surrey-based property developer Philip Rhodes. He bought the 60,000-acre estate for £1.7 million and created Knoydart Peninsula Limited. 7 years later, he'd sold off all but 17,500 acres. In 1993, former Sheffield United chairman Reg Brealey bought what remained. At that time, he was also chairman of Tittiger Jute, a Dundee-based company in serious financial trouble. Mr Brealey thought Knoydart would be the perfect location for a training scheme for disadvantaged youngsters, which he hoped would placate worried shareholders. Knoydart Peninsula Limited became a subsidiary of Tittiger to run his Back to Basics scheme. He wanted to transform this hostel into accommodation to take 70 young people at a time. They would train both in Knoydart and in several international locations. But the scheme was refused planning permission.
It was really a profiteering agenda, because if each child was worth something like £300 to them to look after, if you multiply it by 70, you're talking a lot of money. You're talking of 4 batches of children in a year, you're turning over £1 million. So when he got defeated on that through the planning and through the legitimate processes, it was a bad blow to him, and that was the end as far as Tittiger were concerned with Knoydart.
So Mr Brealey put Knoydart on the market again, and visits to the estate from his Lincolnshire home were rare.
He came in by seaplane, and one of our stockers had to row out in a boat with an umbrella because it was raining, which was really awkward to get him in the boat, plus the oars and the umbrella, right enough, but which we thought was hilarious. And he would come up with a suit on and town shoes on, and instead of walking boots and an old jumper, you know.
I think I saw him 3 times since 1993, and very little contact by phone.
So how did that affect the day-to-day running of the estate?
Well, it made things very difficult. We didn't know what his intentions were, with no direction, and certainly no money.
At Mednectar and Marcus Glen.
Mr Brealey wanted £1.5 million for Knoydart. During its 3 years on the market, residents watched prospective buyers come and go. One of those was the flamboyant former chairman of Blackpool Football Club, Owen Oyston, who was sentenced 2 years ago to 6 years in prison for rape.
Mr Oyston came up, I think, with his family. And that day that he was due to come over, it was rough. The ferry didn't arrive for him, and he couldn't get over. And he was screaming on the phone from Mallaig over to me, saying that he thought it was a conspiracy, how we didn't want him on Knoydart, which was a lot of rubbish. And I explained to him that the ferry had nothing to do with the estate, and it was just unfortunate and it was rough, and then he wanted a private boat to go over and pick him up. And I said, well, if it's too rough for the ferry, then certainly a wee boat wouldn't go out. And he got so angry, and he gave me my books.
But not being the owner, he had no right to fire staff, and Mrs Miller remained as estate secretary. Exasperated residents decided to try and buy the estate for themselves. In November last year, the Knoydart appeal was launched, and £800,000 has been pledged so far. But their offer was rejected. 2 months ago, a new managing director, John Turville, appeared on the estate, fueling speculation that it had been sold. In April, it was reported that Stephen Hinchliffe was the new owner, although residents had no way of verifying that. It's not clear either what drew him to the estate, although he was on the board of Sheffield United at the same time as previous owner Reg Brealey.
What do you think his interest is?
I've never met him. I have absolutely no idea. If he wants to have this place, then he needs to invest quite a lot of money in it.
We wanted to find out more about the new owners. So we visited Invery House, the registered office of Knoydart Peninsula Limited. By law, anyone can go to a registered office and ask who the company's shareholders are. However, when we tried, it wasn't quite as simple as that. Well, it's Wednesday evening, about 6:15, and I've just been into the house behind me, which is the registered office of Knoydart Peninsula Limited. I wanted to see a list of the shareholders of the company. I knocked on the door, a lady half opened the door, and I asked for Mr Turville. She said, "Who are you?" I told her. She said no comment and slammed the door in my face before I even had a chance to ask a question.
This new people, we just haven't been told anything at all. In fact, if we didn't get papers here, we wouldn't have a clue what was going on, which I think is really unfair.
Frontline has established that 100% of the shares in Knoydart Peninsula Limited, or KPL, are now owned by an off-the-shelf company called Zone Chain. In February, Reg Brealey resigned as director of KPL and was replaced by Christopher Harrison, a long-time associate of Mr Hinchliffe, who's also under investigation by the Serious Fraud Office. Mr Hinchliffe's name does not appear on any of the documents, but his solicitor confirmed to Frontline that he is the owner. Still, we wanted to establish for ourselves exactly how KPL is now owned, so we paid another visit to Invery House. This time, the managing director was clearly visible through the window.
Well, I knocked on the door 4 times before I actually got any answer. Nobody opened the door, but a lady from behind asked me what I wanted, and I explained again that I wanted to see a list of shareholders, and she said that was no concern of mine, and she asked me to leave her property, so I have.
What is also unclear is how much money has changed hands in this latest deal. KPL currently owes around £1.4 million to various creditors, and many are puzzled as to why Mr Hinchliffe would want to take that on. But Stephen Hinchliffe's previous business activities have left many questions unanswered. In 1994, he set up a company called Facia Limited and began a major shopping spree. He snapped up a series of high street stores, including Salisbury's, Sock Shop and Red or Dead, most of which were already in the red. In just 2 years, he'd created one of the UK's largest private retailers, second only to Littlewoods. But not everyone was impressed.
I don't regard him as a businessman. And presumably, if you're going to be called a businessman, it presupposes you're in business to run successful businesses.
8-9. Have a think, 8-9.
Salisbury's was just one of the casualties when the Facia empire collapsed in the summer of 1996, with debts estimated at over £30 million. What assets remained, like this fleet of lorries, had to be sold off, but the vast majority of creditors remain unpaid. Hundreds of people were left looking for new jobs. Some were dubious of Mr Hinchliffe's involvement in Facia from the outset.
His reputation went before him to some extent, and I think we were all horrified when we learned that Hinchliffe was going to become involved in the company. And that is when I began to find out that the stories I had heard about him and his business practices were proving to be true.
Salisbury's had debts of £24 million when Facia bought it in 1994. The price tag was £3.2 million, but with annual losses of £4 million, auditors said the company could only survive with support from its new owners. However, as these bank statements show, Facia immediately began taking money out of Salisbury's in regular withdrawals of £100,000. £10 million were moved out of Salisbury's altogether to support some of the other ailing companies owned by Facia. While it was a move unlikely to benefit Salisbury's, it was perfectly legitimate because Facia was entitled to demand repayment of its subsidiaries' debts. This was just one part of an extraordinarily complicated web of transactions between all the companies run by Mr Hinchliffe, a web that receivers are still unravelling. Each time another company was brought into the retail empire, Facia was charged so-called finder's fees by a private company, Chase Montague, owned by Mr Hinchliffe. These totalled over £1 million. On one occasion, Chase Montague even charged Facia £25,000 for locating a private jet. Such arrangements have to be justifiable, according to experts in business failure.
Getting finder's fees for doing some unusually difficult work, if the company had done that work, would itself be a perfectly legitimate tactic, and it may be that the courts at the end of the day will start to raise some questions about whether Chase Montague did enough for its money to merit the kind of finder's fees that it was really charging, or whether this was some sort of unlawful transaction.
Facia also had an unusual lending arrangement with the London branch of an Israeli bank, little known in this country, the United Mizrahi Bank. UMB lent a total of £12 million to Facia. It's alleged that staff received illicit payments for arranging the loans. For example, an unexplained payment of almost £59,000 was made by Facia via one of its subsidiaries to another company called O'Reilly Investments Limited. The head of lending at the United Mizrahi Bank, John Doherty, and his wife were directors of O'Reilly. Doherty was later sacked by the bank. UMB was suing him and other former staff for £1.3 million, allegedly paid to them by Facia. Last month, an out-of-court settlement was reached. We understand UMB was repaid around £750,000. Just one chapter in an eventful business career which has earned Mr Hinchliffe a controversial reputation.
How would you characterise Mr Hinchliffe as a businessman?
Well, fortunately, I haven't got very much money being a professor, but if I had, I probably wouldn't lend it to him.
Mr Hinchliffe's personal circumstances seem to remain unaffected by the collapse of Facia. He still lives just outside Sheffield in his mansion, complete with swimming pool and helicopter landing pad. Parkhead Hall, the one-time headquarters of Facia, which was searched by detectives following its collapse in '96, is still owned by another of Mr Hinchliffe's private companies. But not everything's running smoothly for Knoydart's new owner. The Department of Trade and Industry is bringing a legal action in the autumn against Mr Hinchliffe and Mr Harrison to disqualify them as directors. Both men are being sued for £35 million over the collapse of Facia. And they've also been questioned in the past fortnight by investigators from the Serious Fraud Office.
The prospect of A, being disqualified as director, and B, possibly going to jail are naturally in the forefront of your mind. But given Mr Hinchliffe's apparent dynamism and enterprise, perhaps he could cope with all of these things and develop Knoydart, but it seems pretty unlikely.
As each detail of Mr Hinchliffe's checkered business past trickles through to Knoydart, unease among the locals continues to grow.
Of course I'm suspicious. If somebody can go out of the game for 100 million, being investigated by the Serious Fraud Squad, what does he want this place for? I mean, it's a toy, and people shouldn't be treated like that, and we shouldn't be treating land in Scotland like that.
Behind me is Letterview Estate, 87,000 acres of some of the most wild and spectacular scenery in Wester Ross. Like Knoydart, the estate is owned by a wealthy businessman who hails from outside Scotland. But that's where the similarity ends.
20 years ago, Letterview was bought by Dutch businessman Paul van Vlissingen, and he spends as much time here as he can. Before he bought it, he made sure he travelled around the estate to meet the local people. He considers himself a guardian rather than an owner of the land.
You have to have long-term view to be the guardian of a place. You cannot be like a pigeon in and out of a dovecot. And therefore I think that people who buy estates which are wild land, beautiful land, which they buy for the love of nature, they should say, I'm going to stick here for the rest of my life. You buy an estate like this out of love and not any financial idea behind it.
Although his family business has a long and successful history, he's not ashamed to admit that the estate is not profitable. It's the land, not the money, he treasures.
One cannot be a wealthy person and own a huge tract of land without understanding that the local community rightly expects you to participate in many ways in where they are and who they are, and finding out where their heart lies and what they want in life and how they look upon you coming in. And if that doesn't click, so to speak, I think it's best for parties not to join up, because it's not a world of assets, it's a world of people we live in.
Charlie Littlejohn came to Letterview 40 years ago as head stalker. Since his retirement, he's enjoyed free accommodation on the estate. He believes the constantly changing ownership of Knoydart can only have added to the estate's problems.
It'll be a worry, I would say. A big worry, because they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. They don't know where they are and what kind of bosses they're going to get. And then it just goes change hands. It's not a good thing at all. I don't like it at all, not in the States. It takes a long time to build up these places again after that.
50 years ago, the 7 men of Knoydart made a daring but unsuccessful attempt to reclaim the land from an unpopular owner. Lord Brocket had blocked all attempts by locals to develop the area. The parallels with modern times are striking. Outside Invery House, a land raid of more modest proportions has taken place. Previously unused land has been turned into a market garden by one of the local residents.
We were planning to grow native trees, lilies and vegetables, soft fruit and anything else we can think of.
Have you put quite a lot of work into it?
We've put a lot of work into it. Most of the work's in the preparation of the ground, which has been an ongoing thing for the last 2 or 3 years.
Now this land is actually owned by the estate. Has that posed you any problems over the past couple of years when you've been setting up this project?
Well, because we haven't been able to have we haven't been able to communicate with the owners. Hasn't been possible to talk about a lease. So we're doing it on an informal basis, and we run the risk of being asked to leave.
And that's exactly what has happened. Testament to the lack of investment in the estate is the faded splendour of Invery House. Visitors who pay to stay here have to contend with shabby decor, poor plumbing and drafty bedrooms. Electricity supplies to the whole community are often disrupted because there's been no money to spend on maintaining the hydroelectric plant. Estate staff have to switch it off at regular intervals to conserve energy because of leaks in the dam.
The hydroelectric scheme has probably not been maintained for at least 8 years. That's the plant itself. The pipeline has got leaks and the dam has leaks. The forestry scheme has been completely ignored for 10 years. With very little thinning done. All the roads, less the tarmac road, have not